Okay, since you now know a little bit about my childhood and how I was raised, it's probably time to introduce you to the cast of characters that will appear in quite a few stories. First off, of course, is my dad. My dad was an only child, not because my grandparents only had one child, but because only one child lived more than a few days after he was born. But my dad didn't grow up siblingless, more or less, because living on the ranch at that time was my grandfather's brother, Henry, and his family. Uncle Henry and Aunt Lida will appear in some of the stories, but their children will be in more of the stories. Laura was the oldest, and then came Lewis. Lewis was about a year older than my dad, and then Don. Don was a few months younger than my dad. They were very close because they were what's called milk brothers. Aunt Lida did not make milk when Don was born, and so my grandmother nursed both Daddy and Don. And they lived about 100 yards apart. In this, Henry and Lida and their family lived in the same house that I lived in until I was 10 years old. So about 100 yards apart from their grandmother, who was known as Mother Peebles, and granddad and daddy and my grandmother. And so they were raised more or less like brother and sister. In the 1930s, after Aunt Lida and Uncle Henry had moved to their own ranch over on the Nogal Mesa, the fourth child was born, and his name was Bobby. He probably won't appear in many stories because he was so much younger than the others. But because Lewis and Don grew up very close to my father, they were almost brothers. They just didn't live in the same house. They shared chores. They went to the same schools, had the same teachers, got in trouble together, went fishing together, went hunting together. We grew up calling them Uncle Lewis and Uncle Don, even though they were our cousins. And that's pretty much my father's family. It's Granddad and Honey, and Honey is the name that my brothers and I gave to my grandmother. My grandfather never called her anything but Honey, and so we refused to call her grandmother, so she was known as Honey. My mom and Uncle Henry and Aunt Lida and Lewis and Don and sometimes Bob. Laura married young and moved back to the East Coast, so I think I actually met her maybe 2 or 3 times in my lifetime. So she might be in a couple of stories. I don't think so. Probably not so much. So that's my father's family. My grandmother was, for a long time, the only daughter in a family of boys. She had Uncle Marion, who was the oldest, and Uncle Raleigh, and Uncle Lester. And then after she was born, probably 8 or 9 years, maybe 10 years, Aunt Pete came along. She was kind of a late life baby. My grandmother's family homesteaded about 1904. They came from Kansas in a covered wagon, and they went up into the House area of New Mexico and had a homestead, and then they moved to Roswell. And they were living in Roswell when my grandfather met her, fell in love with her almost instantly. But that's another story. So we have Uncle Marion, who lived in California and came occasionally and was sometimes in some of the stories. Uncle Raleigh, who was not my grandmother's favorite brother, and Uncle Lester, who died in a motorcycle accident fairly young and without children. Uncle Raleigh had one daughter, Laura, and 2 grandchildren, Jim and Pam, until Pam was about 9 or 10 years old, and then Monty came along. So Pam was just about my only female cousin, certainly the only one that I knew very much. And then there's Aunt Pete and Uncle Bill. Aunt Pete's real name was Rachel Marie, but nobody called her Rachel Marie. She was always known as Aunt Pete. And she married Uncle Bill. And Uncle Bill was a rancher and all of that kind of stuff, and became a farmer. Now, Uncle Bill and Aunt Pete had three children. Don and Jeannie were probably 10, 12 years younger than my dad. Um, Jeannie married young and moved to California, so she doesn't appear in many stories. Don does. And because Don was a cousin, he was also probably more often known as Uncle Don. And then Aunt Pete and Uncle Bill had a late life baby, and his name was Lester. And Lester was um, not anywhere near his older siblings. As a matter of fact, he's only 2 years older than I am. And Lester and I were raised more or less as siblings because his mother and father both worked from the time he was a wee one up until the time he was old enough to stay home by himself when he was about 13 or 14 years old. He spent the summers here with my grandparents. And I knew he was a cousin, so he's Cousin Lester. But he was much more of a brother to me than he was a cousin. And then I have my two younger brothers, Jim and Marshall. Jim is almost 2 years younger than I am, and Marshall is almost 3 years younger than I am. Jim and Marshall, just a couple months over a year apart. So that's the nuclear family that most of the stories my family will involve. Of course, I'm going to also still tell stories about my great grandmother's parents and their experiences, as well as my great grandfather's experiences, and somewhat on my grandmother's side. My mother was in the middle of five daughters. It was Aunt Louise, Aunt Georgie, mother, and then Aunt Ima and Aunt Betty. And then after my grandmother's divorce, she married again and had three more children. Martha, who is a couple years older than I am, and Linda Sue and Mary Lou, who are twins and just 6 months younger than I am. I'll tell a couple of stories about the twins and Martha, and probably there will be one or two here or there about family experiences with my mother's sister. So that's my mother's side of the family. I won't tell many stories about my grandmother, my mother's mother, outside to tell you that she was a very wicked, evil, ugly, nasty person. And it's wonder my mother and her sisters survived their upbringing under her care. My mother's father had a very bad accident when my mother was young, probably about 6 or 7. The doctors put him on cocaine for the pain, and he became so addicted that no matter what they did, they couldn't get him off the cocaine. And when I was about 9 years old, he committed suicide. My mother's stepfather was a lovely, kind, generous, oh my God, I cannot believe he actually put up with my grandmother kind of man. Don't have many stories, but he may appear in some of the stories. The most important thing to remember about Grandpa Bill was that he married my grandmother because he felt so sorry for my mother and her sisters that he wanted to make sure that they had a roof over their heads and that they had at least one decent meal every day. How he put up with my grandmother, I don't know, but I think he deserves sainthood for that. Okay, so that's my family. And so I'll probably start with things that I remember growing up. After we got the garden planted and the cattle up on the mountain for the summer, which usually we got the cattle up on the mountain probably around the 1st of May and got the garden planted by the 10th of May. Granddad never wanted to plant a garden before the 10th of May for fear that it would be frosted back. So about the 10th of May, 10th, 11th, 12th, we planted garden. And after that, there really wasn't much to do except milk the cows and take care of the chickens and watch the garden grow, water it and weed it and that kind of stuff. So both my father and my grandfather got summer jobs when I was very little, working for the Forest Service. My grandfather's station was right at the top of the dam at Veneta Dam, and he checked in people coming to go camping up South Fork or wherever, and gave them the rules because we live in New Mexico, and because from May all the way through the 4th of July, it's the dry season, the fire season. There were fire restrictions, what you could and couldn't do. So Granddad would check the campers in and give them the rules and regulations. And a couple of times a day, he would either get on horseback or take the Jeep or the pickup and run up around the campgrounds and make sure that people had what they needed and that they weren't building fires, or that they were building fires only in the designated areas or that kind of stuff. And he would check around and make sure that the fishermen knew that the game warden would be around, and so they shouldn't catch more than their catch of fish, which in those days was 12 fish per person and no fish shorter than 10 inches. Rainbow trout and brown trout and that kind of thing out of the lakes or out of the rivers. And then he would do one check right before right after dark, and then he would come home, and he and Dad got home about the same time, and they would milk the cows, and we'd have dinner, and everybody would go to bed. Granddad whistled us in at 5 o'clock the next morning, feeding the horses and milking the cows and doing our chores, and then he and Dad would take back off. Dad's station was up Eagle Creek. In those days, there was little summer village up at the head of Eagle Creek where people had built cabins and stuff like that they stayed in. But there were several campgrounds along Eagle Creek. Actually, there still are a couple of campgrounds along Eagle Creek. And Dad would be down at the bottom before the first campground. And he would do the same thing Granddad did, check people in, find out what campground they were going to, tell them where there were vacancies in campgrounds, give them the fire restrictions and that kind of stuff. And it was most days, not every day, but most days I went with Dad to work, because by the time I was 2 or 3 years old, Mom was pregnant with my brothers. She had, 2 babies, a little over a year apart, probably both in diapers at the same time, garden to take care of, and all that kind of thing. So I went to work with Daddy. And I remember that while Daddy was talking to the driver about the rules and regulations and checking them in, I would go over to the passenger side, and I had a bunch of little sandwich bags. And on a sticker on each sandwich bag that was a little bee. And it said on the little label, "Don't be a litter bug." And so I would get them to roll their window down, and I would hand them a little paper bag and say, "Please, put your trash in the proper receptacle, and here is a litter bag for your car so you don't have to throw anything out the window." And that's probably about as much as I could remember. But I can remember sitting underneath a tree, eating sandwiches with my dad, and going out and meeting each of the cars. Sometimes, we would sit for hours and no one would come. And sometimes, I'm sure it was after lunch when I was taking my nap, cars would come through. And sometimes I got to walk around to the other side. And I remember as well, on the days that my dad had days off, he would take me fishing with him. And I had my fishing pole and my tackle box, and I always had worms or corn in my tackle box. And Dad was a fly fisherman, so we didn't go to the lakes. We went to some rivers. He always knew where the best pools were. As a matter of fact, I don't know for sure, but I have a great suspicion that he went out in the springtime and would take boulders and pile them up and kind of make a dam to make little pools. He'd dam across the river and with just stacking boulders up, and he would take them out of the side next to the bank here and out of the side next to the bank there and move the boulders around, and he would make his own little fishing holes where he knew that fish would like to be. And he would take me out fishing with him, and we had a cooler with ice in it in the back of the Jeep. And I would take my tackle box and I would go up a certain place, and Daddy'd say, "Will you fish right there?" Well, the place where I fished was wide and it was very shallow and it was very rocky. As a matter of fact, even at 4 or 5 years of age, I could wade across it, no pool. Did I ever catch a fish? Well, yes, I did. But this is how it happened. Dad would fish and fish, and when he got his 12, he would bring his string up and he would stake it down in the river right next to me, and he would say, when the game warden comes, you tell him that these are your fish. You put your fishing pole over here on the ground, and you can sit, and here's a coloring book, and here's a book to read, and you read and color, and when the game warden comes, that's your fish. You caught every one of those. And you can tell him any story you want about how hard they were to catch. And then he'd go back down to his fishing hole and he'd catch another 12 fish. And I can remember the game warden coming and coming to me and saying, how's the fishing today? And I'd say, "Oh, it was really good. I caught my limit. I'm just waiting for Dad." And he'd say, "Well, can I see your fish?" And I'd say, "Sure." And he'd take out his little measuring thing and he'd measure each one of them and he'd say, "Boy, that's a big one. I bet he fought hard." And I'd say, "Oh, yeah, I had a hard time dragging him in." Well, I don't know if he thought I was fishing where I was sitting, right there where there were no pools and no way a fish that size could be there, or if he knew what was going on, and I was simply there to raise my father's limit on fishing. Because in those days, I think still even in New Mexico, you don't have to have a fishing license until you're 12 years of age. So, I just extended my father's limit going fishing with him. But my dad was a great fisherman, and we would take a couple of dozen fish home, and that would be our dinner that night. The whole family would gather together and eat these fish. And my dad would clean them and descale them, and my grandmother would roll them in masa and cornmeal and fry them in a skillet. It took all four of her big cast iron skillets and all four burners on her stove, and she would fry up all those fish, and we'd have something out of the garden, a salad or vegetables or something out of the garden, and sit and eat fish. And probably the best fish I ever ate were those fish that I caught with my daddy. Up to this day, I will tell you, I have been fishing on boats. I have been fishing in the ocean. I have fished on lakes, on the shore. I have fished on lakes and boats. I have fished in streams. The only fish I have ever caught were the fish that I caught with my dad. But I can tell you, I do know how to put a worm on a hook, and I do know how to put corn on a hook. Probably I could actually put eggs on a hook too and that kind of stuff. Don't have any problem with that. Just never caught a fish. Well, outside the ones that I caught with my dad. And that's the story I'm sticking to. By the time I was 5, my dad, was I 5? No, I was 4. They were putting in a new road between Capitan and Ruidoso so that you didn't have to go all the way down to Fort Stanton and come back up that way, or go up Dark Canyon to get to Ruidoso from Capitan. I remember that my dad worked for that almost a whole year. I don't know if he worked for the Forest Service that year or if he worked for the Highway Department. But for a whole year, it seemed like he worked putting in Highway 48 from Ruidoso all the way to Capitan. So when I started to school, instead of going down to the Fort Stanton Road to catch the bus, I went up to Highway 48 to catch the bus. It was the first year that that road was there when I started school. So, but by the time I was 9, a man by the name of Robert O. Anderson, who was a skier, and was very, very wealthy man, and he wanted to put in a ski run closer to where he lived. So he hired my dad and a young, newly graduated high school boy to do a survey up where Ski Apache is today. And in order to do that, they had to spend the entire winter up on the mountain measuring snow at certain points to see if it was feasible to put in a ski run. So Daddy and Granddad packed in all the nails and all the tar paper and all kinds of stuff that they needed to build a cabin. And then they had plane fly and drop plywood into the park. There was no road up there. The only way to get in was to either go across Rodemaker and in from Monjo, or to take the trail that came up through the reservation. The only people that were allowed to use the trail through the reservation was my dad and granddad, and that's another story I'll get to later. So they flew the materials in, and then dad and granddad built I think it was an 8 by 10 cabin, using only hand tools that they had packed in either by horse, and except for the plywood and the metal for the roof, which was dropped from an airplane in. And then Roger and Dad spent the entire winter up there measuring snow and it was really wonderful, I think, because Dad they were paid very, very well for that snow survey. And then they determined that it was feasible and there was enough snow for a ski run. So Robert Anderson bought the government lease from Daddy and Granddad for a certain amount, and I don't know what it was, and a permanent job for my father working on the ski run for the rest of his life. That began the building of what was first Sierra Blanca and now is Ski Apache. Ski Apache is the mountain itself. Sierra Blanca is on the reservation. It's the Apache's sacred mountain, and it's on the reservation. But from Lookout Mountain toward the south is on Lincoln National Forest, and so the ski run itself is built on forest land. So the first thing they did was survey the road, and then they surveyed where the lifts and the buildings and stuff needed to be done, and then they spent all one summer building the road up there. And the road up there was for four-wheel drives only. You could not take a normal car up there. And they built a place called Cat House on Cat House Corner, where they kept a bulldozer because the wind would blow the snow over the road, and they had to have a bulldozer to bulldoze the snow off the road, so that they could get the cars up. The first year that it was open, they didn't have any lifts at all. They had a Christie Cat, and they would take the people up to the top of what's the Capitan lift line in the Christie Cat, and then let them ski down, pick them up at the bottom, and take them back up again. And then the next year, they started putting in the lift lines. And so from the time I was about 9 on, my dad worked weekends on the ranch, helping Granddad, and Mom and Granddad pretty much took care of the cows. Dad worked for Robert Anderson, building Sierra Blanca, which is now Ski Apache. All of the surveying, all of the lift lines, most of the trails for the first 10 years that were there was work that my dad did. We life changed for us, but in such a fantastic way because we got to go to work with dad every weekend in the wintertime because we were his gophers. You know, Donna, go for this. Jim, go for that. Marshall, go do this. You know, we carried lunches to the lift operators. We gave the lift operators a break by operating the lifts while they ate their lunches. We went to we helped out with the ski patrol, taking them the things that they needed. I spent a lot of hours in the first aid shack sewing up the ski pants of people who were wearing ski pants that were too tight and busted them out, or sitting with people who had broken legs or keeping ice on sprains and stuff like that. But I got to do a lot of skiing as well. So, you know, when you're gophering this and you're gophering that, a lot of time you're gophering on skis, and that was a lot of fun. But the most fun was that during Christmas vacation or on weekends, during spring break, we got to be at the ski run, skiing and doing the things that we wanted to do. This was all very, very wonderful until 1963 when my grandfather had a stroke and ended up in the hospital in August. My father was killed accidentally on the ski run late that month. And then my entire life changed. So most of my stories are going to be stories up until that point, and then I'll talk about stories I was told about my grandfather's life and my great grandfather's life and my great great grandfather's life, and stories that my grandfather told me, and stories that I found out through research myself, through ancestry or things like that. Probably every once in a while, I'll throw in a story about things that happened to my sons as they occur to me. So, goodbye for now.